Welcome back, casual gardeners. There are some things that we believed for a long time, but it turns out they were just silly. Eating before you go swimming won't actually give you cramps. Trying to read a book in the dark won't make you go blind, and neither will that other thing that people are always saying will make you go blind.
Oh my.
It turns out there's a lot of old-timer advice about growing tomatoes that is equally silly. Baking soda will sweeten your tomatoes by raising the pH of the soil and making your fruit less acidic. The pH of your soil is going to have little or nothing to do with the flavor of the fruits of your tomato plant. If your soil pH actually determined tomato flavor, and if basic pH yielded sweeter tomatoes, I would get nothing but super sweet tomatoes because my soil has an average pH somewhere between 7.5 and 8. Soil, you basic. What really determines the flavor of your tomatoes is going to be the cultivar of the tomato that you plant. If you don't like the way your tomatoes taste, plant different tomatoes. That's really the only way you're going to change the flavor of your fruit. You need to pinch the top off your tomato plant at planting time to make it grow bushier and give you a better harvest. Tomatoes come in many different varieties and can be trellised in many different ways. The way we prune our tomatoes is going to depend on the variety of the tomato and our personal goals for how our garden needs to look and work. I prefer growing single or double leader vines up stakes. Pinching off the top won't work for me. I don't want to encourage bushy growth. Even if you're growing determinate tomato plants, you still probably don't want to pinch off the top because determinate tomato plants have a bushy growth habit naturally. Planting an egg in your tomato hole with your tomato will give you better plant growth because that egg is full of nutrients that will help your tomato grow. Some gardeners say you should crack an egg into the hole as you plant your tomatoes. Other gardeners say just put a whole egg down that hole. And some gardeners will even say put several eggs down the hole.
Don't look down the hole.
Even if eggs weren't currently too expensive, there'd still be some problems with this idea. I mean, probably the least problematic is if you bury intact eggs, you're going to wind up with a garden that smells like rotten eggs. It's not cool. And if you bury your eggs deep enough that you won't smell them, those nutrients are going to be down where the tomato plant can't reach them. To make matters worse, the smell of eggs in your soil, rotten or otherwise, is going to attract animals that like to eat eggs. So they're going to be tearing up your tomato plant, which isn't very good for the tomato plant at all. There's a reason we use compost in our gardens instead of just tossing our food on top of the soil and saying, "Come and get it!" And that's because plant material and really any nutrient source needs to break down a bit before the plants can access the nutrients from that material. The egg you drop down that hole isn't going to be available nutritionally until next year. You should save your eggs for a delicious breakfast or to bake a cake. You can add eggshells to your soil, either in the hole or just mixed in, whatever. And the calcium from those eggshells will help prevent blossom end rot in your tomatoes. Eggshells can take a long time to break down. You're not doing your plant any favors by using eggshells as any kind of fertilizer. Eggshells can be a good source of calcium, and theoretically, if there's enough of them, they could even help aerate your soil. Nobody eats enough eggs to produce enough eggshells to help aerate the soil. It's a terrible idea to add anything to your soil if you haven't had your soil tested and found that you do indeed have a shortage of that thing first. A lot of land-grant university extension services offer soil testing for reasonable prices. It's a good idea to get your soil tested before you just start adding stuff to it willy-nilly. My soil is naturally high in calcium, and I mean like super high. In Utah, on average, our soil contains anywhere from 15 to 40% calcium lime by mass, and that's a lot. That's a lot. There's already a ton of calcium in there, but I still get blossom end rot. Adding eggshells probably isn't gonna hurt anything. Even in my soil, where I've already got plenty of calcium. Save your eggshells for your friends or neighbors who raise chickens, because those girls could use the calcium, and they can access it right away. You can prevent blossom end rot by adding Epsom salts to your tomatoes. There are lots of people who like adding Epsom salts, and they think that it helps prevent blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is a condition that's caused by poor calcium availability in the soil. But just because the calcium isn't available, that doesn't mean it isn't there. It could happen because your soil is low in calcium, or it could happen because something is preventing the roots of the plant from taking up that calcium that is there. Whatever is causing your blossom end rot, Epsom salts can't do anything about it because Epsom salts contain 0 calcium. The chemical formula of Epsom salt is, well, it's hydrated magnesium sulfate. So that's magnesium, sulfur, oxygen, and good old H2O. There's no calcium in Epsom salts. Not only do Epsom salts contain no calcium, but magnesium is chemically similar enough to calcium that it can be taken up by the roots instead of calcium. Adding Epsom salts to your soil, if you added enough to change anything, would actually make your blossom end rot worse. Luckily, most of us don't add enough Epsom salts to make a difference. But ideally, you should save those Epsom salts for a nice foot soak after a hard day of gardening. Adding turmeric in your planting hole will improve the growth of your tomatoes by fertilizing them, and it will also act as an antifungal and an antibiotic in the soil. Turmeric is recommended in videos on a bunch of sketchy YouTube gardening channels, and they claim it does all sorts of amazing stuff. Unfortunately, it's completely bunk. The good news is, turmeric won't hurt your tomatoes. So if you've already got turmeric down your planting hole or sprinkled around the surface of your soil, you can leave it there. It'll be fine. Turmeric is not a good fertilizer. Its nutrient concentration is pretty low. It's about 1% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, and 1% potassium. So it's a very mild fertilizer. It is ground small, so it'll break down pretty quick and become available about as quickly as most organic fertilizers. But in terms of total nutrient concentration, it's about equivalent to compost. But think about how much turmeric you're adding. Hardly any. Just like a spoonful per plant tops. Would you expect results if you added a spoonful of compost to your plants? So if you wanted to substitute some sort of actual more concentrated fertilizer for that turmeric, you will see better benefits in terms of overall plant growth than you would from that little sprinkle of approximately compost. The antifungal and antibacterial properties of turmeric are real, and I have actually managed to find a couple of studies where growers found that tomatoes benefited from the addition of turmeric to soil. But the amount of turmeric that they used is quite a lot. 2 to 3% weight by volume. It's way more than that little spoonful. So I guess what I'm saying is, save your turmeric for a nice dinner. You can add an antacid with calcium to prevent blossom end rot in your tomatoes. The advantage of adding a calcium-based antacid into your planting hole instead of, say, Epsom salts is that at least a calcium-based antacid like Tums does contain calcium. But as we discussed earlier, blossom end rot isn't always caused by too little calcium in the soil. I've gotten blossom end rot in my Utah soil, which has more than enough calcium for any plant to do anything it wants. You're much better off watering regularly and deeply, putting mulch around the base of your tomato plant. That will allow the roots to stay cool and healthy and hydrated and pick up the calcium that is available to them. And you can save your antacids for when you've overindulged at a fancy restaurant. You just always need to remove those tomato suckers. Just pinch them all off. Don't leave the suckers on those tomatoes. There is technically no such thing as a tomato sucker. There are suckers on plants, but what tomatoes do doesn't qualify. But that terminology is so deeply entrenched in how we talk about tomatoes that I'm not going to waste my time trying to change that today. Folks seem to have an almost religious fervor when it comes to picking off suckers. Whenever you remove a sucker, whether it fits with your trellising method or not, you are reducing the production of your tomato plant. And for this reason, since most of us grow tomatoes to get that sweet, sweet tomato fruit, you want to think about how you're dealing with your suckers, and do you really want to get rid of that sucker? Growing determinate plants, removing suckers is going to be especially hurtful to your yield. You can cut it drastically. Determinate plants are plants that will grow to a set size, fruit all at once, and then be done for the season. A determined size. That's why we call them determinate. If you're pulling off those suckers off your determinate tomato plant, you're basically telling that plant, that's a branch of tomatoes you just aren't ever going to grow anymore. If you're like me and you prefer to grow indeterminate tomato varieties, so tomatoes that will just keep growing and fruiting until frost kills them, there are still going to be times when you might want to keep a sucker. Say one of my double-leader vines gets damaged, or I've had to top it because it reached the top of my stake and I don't feel like climbing a ladder to get to my tomatoes. Well, then I'm going to very intentionally allow one of those suckers to grow and become another vine for me so that I can keep getting fruit until that plant is dead. So in my opinion, you should save your tomato sucker dogma for never. Dogma-free gardens are happy gardens. You should plant your tomato deep so it will have more roots and grow more vigorously. There are two types of roots that most kinds of plants can grow. You've got your feeder roots and you've got your adventitious roots. It's true that tomatoes can grow adventitious roots along their length, but those new roots are not going to be as good at eating and feeding the plant as the roots that it grew initially down below the soil. So when we plant our tomatoes deep, we're not necessarily ensuring that the more roots we get are going to do any good for the plant nutritionally. Now, another issue is planting deep means that the definitely feeder roots are further down beneath the surface of the soil. The deeper we go, the less oxygen penetrates down to the roots. Plant roots actually do metabolism a lot more like we do. They burn sugar, they breathe in oxygen, and they breathe out carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide is exhaled.
The deeper we bury the roots, the less oxygen they get, and the less efficiently they're going to work. If you really want to get that sweet, sweet adventitious root action, plant your tomato so that the root ball is kind of sideways, closer to the surface, and then train the top of the tomato up onto your trellising structure. That way you can kind of get the best of both worlds, because you're keeping the feeder roots close to the surface where they can most efficiently feed. You should never refrigerate tomatoes because you will ruin the flavor. When temperatures drop below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, what is that, 7 degrees Celsius? Find out here if I guessed right. The enzymatic activity in a tomato plant starts to slow down, and if it gets cool enough, like around 4 degrees Celsius, which is the running temperature of most refrigerators, that enzymatic activity is going to stop. When you warm it back up, it's not necessarily going to start again. So it's true that if you put an unripe tomato into your refrigerator, it will never ever ripen. You've just screwed that up. Once a tomato has ripened, whether or not it's in a refrigerator, it's all downhill from there. It starts to break down, just like I did after my 40th birthday. At that point, putting your tomato in the refrigerator and slowing down and even stopping the enzymatic activity of that fruit is going to keep it closer to peak flavor longer. Just as, well, there's no equivalent for me. I'm just going bad. So yes, it is true, don't put unripe tomatoes in your fridge. You'll screw them up. But once your tomato has reached the level of ripeness that you prefer, you probably better refrigerate it if you're not going to eat it right away. If you're worried about the flavor, because cold tomatoes don't taste quite as flavorful, allow it to come back to room temperature before you eat it. A lot of those molecules that give tomatoes their flavor aren't as likely to vaporize and smack their way into your nose where you can have a flavor happen when they're cold. So just allowing them to warm up before you eat that tomato is going to take it right back to where it was before you refrigerated it. That was 10 old-timer tomato tips that you can skip. There are so many weird tomato tips out in the wild. There's no way I could have gotten to all of them. So if you have a favorite tip that you just want to bag on, please do that down in the comments. At best, these tips are wasting people's time. At worst, they could actually be hurting the plants. This was a pretty stinking sweet video, and you think so too. Shut up, yes you do. So hit the like button, make sure you're subscribed to my channel. And as always, thank you for joining me here in my garden today. Hope you have a wonderful time in your own.